we're going to start with introductions, remarks from the U.S. Department of State Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons. We'll cover definitions of human trafficking and forced labor. And then pitch it over. Michael Vaudreuil is going to be outlining the risk of human trafficking in the facility services sector, as covering due diligence approaches, which is really what we've done about the risks. We're going to highlight some of the resources available, and then we're going to try to be on time and save 15 minutes for questions. And we don't have time to field questions as we go, but we're going to be writing them down and bringing them up at the end. So was there anything else I was supposed to cover? I think you know that we're recording, and I'll just go over to our introductions. I'm going to start with Michael Vaudreuil, Senior Director at Verité and leader of our human rights due diligence practice group.
Hi, everybody. So Michael Vaudreuil, and as Lydia said, I lead Verité's Enterprise Human Rights Due Diligence Practice Group. And what that means is we help companies either improve or establish their systems for addressing human rights risks in their own operations and in their supply chain. And I've been doing this type of work at Verité since I started here about 12 years ago. And prior to that, I was with Hewlett-Packard for a little more than 20 years, initially in the EHS organization, then into facilities, and ultimately into procurement, where I got into the human rights area in forming what was then the EICC Electronic Industry Code of Conduct, which turned into the RVA. And long time ago, I started out as a compliance officer for OSHA in Rhode Island. And I'll turn it over to Amy O'Neill Richard. She is the Senior Supply Chain Policy Advisor for State Department.
Thank you, Michael. Good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on your location. First, I would like to begin by acknowledging that this month marks National Human Trafficking Prevention Month. As we close out January, we are excited to finish strongly with today's launch. On behalf of the State Department's Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to all of you joining us here today to learn more about the risk management tools for the facility services sector, for the Responsible Sourcing Tool, or RST for short. RST has been a multi-year project, a collaboration between Verité and our office here at the Department of State to provide federal contractors, procurement officials, and other private sector companies with resources to assess and manage risk in their supply chains. Verité has long championed the Responsible Sourcing Tool initiative every step of the way, as we both have sought to provide easily accessible, complementary, and downloadable tools for federal contractors and those companies that wish to better prevent, identify, and address human trafficking in their global supply chains and develop effective risk management systems. We're appreciative of Verité's collaboration over several years, and we're proud of the site, the research, and tools. We think the RST tools have benefited from this partnership and leveraging the expertise of both the U.S. government and Verité on human trafficking, supply chain management, labor rights, and corporate social responsibility. We believe that RST is strengthened by the wisdom of its users, as the site's original development involved input from federal contractors, non-governmental organizations, corporate officers, and survivors, or those with lived experiences of forced labor. We continue to enhance RST's resources to serve our stakeholders. Today, we're sharing the latest installment of due diligence tools. We think the time is right to share new resources as we, the collective we, are at a critical juncture. There is renewed energy and focus across the US government and the world to leverage diplomatic, regulatory, law enforcement, and trade tools to better prevent and address human trafficking in global supply chains. There's a demand for practical tools, and you'll hear more about the tools for the facility sector, which covers many areas, ranging from janitorial services to waste management, to grounds maintenance, to housekeeping services. Such resources are also key, as this sector has risks related to the recruitment and hiring of staff, the labor provided at the workplace, and its far-reaching supply chain with products ranging from cleaning supplies and pesticides to uniforms and equipment. Thus, let me not stand in the way of your learning more. Once again, we are truly grateful for your time, and I'm going to turn it back to you, Lydia.
I'm going to actually just start talking about Verité. Verité, many of you know us, but for those of you who don't, we're a US-based nonprofit founded almost 30 years ago now, working to integrate human rights into the way companies conduct their business, remove barriers to workers advocating for and realizing their rights, and strengthen the role of governments in setting and enforcing robust human rights policies. We work across sectors in partnership with the key stakeholders in the change process: governments, MSIs, brands, suppliers, worker organizations, and their advocates. We do this through research, assessments and investigations, capacity building, with tools and training, and human rights due diligence consultation. Mainly, though not only with a focus on human trafficking, child labor, discrimination, and worker voice. A major platform for public sharing of our research and tools to support action on trafficking and forced labor is what we call the RST, or Responsible Sourcing Tool, which we developed with the support of the US Department of State. Its core target has been federal contractors and helping them achieve compliance with the FAR, but it's evolved into a significant resource for companies and other stakeholders trying to understand the nature of trafficking risk and what they can do about it. The trafficking in persons definition is in the Palermo Protocol, officially the UN Protocol to prevent, suppress, and punish trafficking in persons, especially women and children, which covers both sexual and labor exploitation. You can read here the elements of the definition: recruitment, transport, harboring of people, using coercion, fraud, generally the abuse of power over those who are vulnerable. As it relates to the facility service sector, what we see most commonly is the recruitment, typically deception, if you click again, Michael, for the purposes of exploitation resulting in forced labor. That's the most common, and I think Michael will be focusing more on that. So what is forced labor? If you advance for me, thanks. The definition of the state of forced labor is in Article 2 of ILO Convention 29, going back more than 90 years. And simply stated, forced or compulsory labor is all worker service, which is extracted from any persons under the menace of any penalty, and for which the said person has not offered himself voluntarily. The definition is pretty simple, but the determination of whether or the degree to which there's a menace of penalty and involuntariness is calculated through elaborate weighing of numerous, I believe 67 indicators in these 11 categories. But rather than provide concrete examples of this, I'm going to pitch it over to Michael now, who will get into that, as well as how to prevent and mitigate these factors. So over to you, Michael.
Thanks, Lydia. So we are going to first talk a little bit about what the facility services sector is, and then get into the risks and the due diligence process to best control those. As I go through it, for each element of due diligence, I'll try and describe the tools that are available on the RST, the Responsible Sourcing Tools site, for you to be able to download and utilize. So, what is the sector? As Amy said, it's pretty much everything, right? Companies these days are focused on having their own resources work on only the development and delivery of their own products and services. So in the spirit of cost effectiveness, virtually everything else is contracted out. When I started with Hewlett Packard, like 30 plus years ago, everybody on that site was an HP employee, from the gardener to the guard. And now, like every other company in the world, all of those folks are service providers. Some of them belong to large integrated organizations that provide a variety of services, and others are small operations that do only pest control or only food service or whatever it might be. So the sector is very broad. It employs millions of people here in the US, and obviously many more than that globally. And there are quite a number of risks involved that we'll get into here. As Lydia was highlighting, what we see most often in facility services and in many other sectors are the issues around recruitment, and how recruitment can lead to the presence of those indicators that she described for forced labor. So, that opaque, what we're calling an opaque supply chain, meaning you don't know every layer in that supply chain from where the worker originated to where they ended up on your site or on your subcontractor's site. How were they hired? How was that job advertised? What were they told about the job? How much did they pay to get that job? That is all quite invisible when a service is contracted out. In the old days, like I was saying, you as a company hired those people directly. You had control over the hiring process. You knew what the worker was being told about the job, and things were pretty straightforward. But now in facility services and virtually every other sector, whether it's agriculture or industry, that is not so visible and not as easily controlled. And that's compounded by the fact that the type of work in facility services is very typically low-skilled, low-wage work, which means there are more foreign migrants present. Foreign migrants typically do not have the ability to look for something better. They don't have the skill set to do something better. And this is the type of work that they take, which adds even more complexity to that supply chain. They're often charged recruitment fees, sometimes not very much, sometimes quite a bit. I was in the Middle East a couple of years ago talking to a number of facilities workers who were recruited by a local company from West Africa. And they were told about the job they were going to get, which was not the job they had. They were told what the work entailed, what the pay was, and virtually everything that they were told about that job did not exist, on top of the fact that they had to pay fees. So And I could give you countless examples from virtually all around the world, including here in the US. And so it's very, very, very common because of the complex labor supply chain, the nature of the work that we run into, and we often see these forced labor risks. It's compounded by the fact that this is done the work is done at a site other than the one that's owned by their employer. So a facilities services company, a janitorial company, will send their workers off to a variety of different places over which they have no control. They don't control the practices of that client, the conditions of that client's work site, and that too can lead to issues, as well as the fact that some of these locations may involve hazardous work or working in a hazardous environment doing simple tasks like janitorial work, and they could be very isolated. They may not be able to communicate directly by cell phone to outside. That may be one of the rules at the client site, that you can't use a cell phone. And all of these things, the way the work is done, where it's done, the fact that people are working in small groups dispersed across a wide geographical area, all present barriers to them being able to organize, to join or form a union and advocate for themselves and for their rights. So how do we get our arms around these risks? How do we make sure that this isn't going on in our operations, in our contractors' operations? And if it is, how do we take care of it? And so there's a concept of due diligence. And we're going to spend the rest of this presentation talking about that, but wanted to just kind of let everyone know that due diligence is a process. It isn't something that you do once and it's done. It isn't simply creating a policy and saying, oh, we have a policy, everyone's supposed to follow it, we can wash our hands of this. It isn't just doing audits. It's an entire cycle that needs to be put in place, fully integrated within the business in order for it to be effective. Now, we've called it a number of different things over the years, but recently the world is kind of heading toward kind of coalescing or coming together on the OECD due diligence framework for responsible business conduct. And the OECD framework takes the UN guiding principles on business and human rights that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, and it essentially operationalizes it. It puts it in a structured way for organizations to identify and address human rights risks, including trafficking in persons. This kind of tinker toy representation that you're looking at, as we call it, is our way of showing how the OECD due diligence cycle works. And it begins with embedding human rights. And what does embedding human rights mean? It means that rather than just being something that's a sign on the door or posting on a website, it means that human rights is built into everything that the organization does, beginning with having a policy to making sure that whatever the company's doing in terms of its strategic decision making, that human rights is a formal element of that and not an afterthought. And we'll get into that in more detail. The next one is assessing risks and impacts. You can't address an issue unless you know what it is, where it is, and how significant it is. So there's the risk assessment piece, and then you get into controlling those risks. And the OECD and the UNGP call it cease, prevent, and mitigate, because obviously the most effective way of addressing risk is to stop doing whatever it is that's causing the risk. When that is impossible, then you can get into prevention and mitigation activities. And then there's tracking, sometimes called monitoring, which is, how are we doing? There's all of this work that all of these controls that we've put in place, the capacity building that we've done, is it actually resulting in a reduction in impacts on people? Are we seeing less deception in recruitment? Are we seeing less workers paid fees? Whatever the issue might be, is what we're doing effective? And that's what tracking is. And then there's remediation, which we're showing here as a separate element of the process, but it's actually something that goes throughout the cycle. When you're assessing risk, you'll find something that needs to be remediated, an impact on an individual. As you're putting controls in place, the same thing. So remediation is something that occurs throughout this, although we're showing it here as a separate element. And finally, there's reporting. This is something that used to be quite voluntary, but now companies that are subject to the upcoming EC Sustainable Corporate Due Diligence Directive, as well as a number of the individual country directives, will have to report on their progress. And this is specific reporting, as we'll get into in a little bit. The rest of this is it's kind of the details around these. Don't worry about this right now. As I said, we're going to be going through each of these elements of due diligence, and we'll just discuss these in some detail. So let's talk about the embedding. As I said before, this is the key to effective due diligence. It's building this into the business. Now, of course, it starts with a policy, in this case, a policy on trafficking in persons, but obviously for an organization that is looking at their entire responsible business conduct, it's going to be health, safety, all human rights, environment, and the like. So what is the company committing to in terms of this? The policy here, as we're talking about the U.S. Federal Acquisition Regulation and the specifics on preventing trafficking in persons, there's a listing of everything that the law prohibits, and clearly all of that needs to be built into the policy, as well as other international standards that a company adheres to or wants to aspire to. But then where the rubber meets the road is, how does the company take these policy commitments and make them real? And that means building it into the way a company does business. So if you are in the procurement organization and you are looking at expanding your supply chain into another country, how do you integrate the risks that may be associated with the product or the service that you're procuring from that country? How does that enter into your contracting process? Is it something you ignore? Is it something that becomes an issue for you that is a no-go? If you find an issue, you don't contract, or is it something that you would work with a potential contractor to address before you bring them on board? So that works for procurement. It applies to facilities, and in this case, facilities does much of the hiring of janitorial firms, of cafeteria providers, of landscapers. And so the same types of decision-making need to be built into how a facilities organization seeks and manages on an ongoing basis providers of the facility services it requires. These commitments need to also be part of business strategy. Business strategy is discussed typically at the executive level or in the board. on the board, I should say. So if the company is looking at expanding its operations into another region in the world, they're looking to develop new products and services. As part of that strategizing, determining how to go forward, the human rights risks of that venture, of that new expansion need to be considered, need to be incorporated into how that part of the strategy is developed and implemented. In terms of executive accountability not only needs to be assigned, and when you guys think about some of the old audit criteria that used to be in place, there was a check the box. You know, is somebody in charge of safety? Is somebody in charge of this? And that's a great starting point, but what does it mean to be accountable? It means that formal responsibility and accountability is in that person's job description. It's in their performance evaluation. And then at the executive level, it's in their variable compensation. If the company does not meet its goals for preventing trafficking in persons or other human rights issues, it hits them in the pocketbook. And that is one of the key ways to make sure that this is all embedded in the company's business system. And then the board, of course, needs to be the ultimate oversight body for the company's human trafficking and human rights efforts. And it needs to be part of their business, their regular meetings. There should be a board committee that's assigned responsibility for this, but again, that there's formal accountability. And all of this together really helps that the rest of the system that we'll be talking about now actually functions and has a chance of being effective. So as we go to assessing risks, it's can be fairly straightforward, but the process you follow is the risk is found at a number of different levels. There's country level risk, which means some countries, because of the way the legal structure, because of the socioeconomics of that country, there are risks of human trafficking that are particular to that country and maybe not to others. There's the risk of the sector. In this case, facilities, but you can break it down to the individual services. You know, what are the risks of human trafficking associated with the type of work that's done? You know, do they rely on migrants? Is it 3D work? What exactly are those risks? And then you take those and you combine them. So you're looking at a facility service provider in this part of this country. How do all those risks come together to give you an idea of what are the highest risk services and potential suppliers that you should be looking at in more detail? And that brings you down to the last one, which is after you've identified the country and sector risks of concern, you then look at the specifics of that organization. What do you know about them from media information, from regulatory reports, from audits that you may have done on that organization? What do you know about how they identify and manage their potential human rights risks, in particular trafficking in persons? And then you need to look at the labor supply chain. So you've got a company that's doing facility services in Malaysia. You know, what now do you have to do to identify to get into the real nitty-gritty of the real granular elements of the risks that may be presented? And labor supply chain is, as we mentioned a couple of times already, is a place that you really need to focus. Where are the workers coming from? Are they local workers that you're hiring directly? Are they local workers that are coming through your facility services provider directly? Or are they from another country where they have to go through many different layers of subagents and agents before they make it to your site? Doing all of this, figuring this out, you need to understand the more complex that labor supply chain is, the more layers that are involved, the less visibility and control you have over it. And so that is a big part of the risk. If you can't see what's going on, if you don't know who's doing the recruiting in the village in Nepal or in India, then you are not going to be able to control that risk. And there's understanding the work, and we talked a little bit about the work being 3D work, and it's largely unskilled. And then that last piece about what does it mean to be working on a third-party site? What are the additional risks that may be that may come from that? So all of this helps you identify and prioritize the risks that you need to then determine how you're going to control. And in controlling risk, you start with recruitment. The most important thing is thorough due diligence of the labor supply chain. What does that mean? That means screening all of the actors that may be involved in doing that work for you. And on the responsible sourcing tool site, there is a tool for screening labor agents that really get to the heart of the risks that they may present. Number one, are they licensed? So does the local government and where they operate recognize them as a recruitment agency? You know, what due diligence processes do they have in place? Do they have their own policy for not charging worker fees, for example? How much information do they give to prospective job seekers? When do they give it? All of this is done in that screening of agents. If you decide to go with a particular agent, or if the service provider decides to go with a particular agent, the service agreements between the company and that agent have to be very specific in terms of what is allowed and what is not allowed. And much of that is very clearly spelled out in the federal acquisition regulations about the types of fraudulent practices that aren't allowed, what needs to be provided in the employment contract around wages and location of work and the like. So service agreements need to be in place. Another thing is a way of ensuring that and verifying that the employer, whether it's a third party, whether it's the subcontractor, is paying those fees up front, and you don't have to go through reimbursing workers once you've found that for whatever reason they were asked to pay fees. Capacity building is a big part of this. And then ultimately the lowest risk, the best solution in ceasing and preventing human trafficking risks is to hire directly. This isn't a common practice among smaller firms. It certainly isn't among the large organizations that hire facility services providers. But if a facility service provider can avoid using labor agents and recruit and hire workers directly, that's a huge reduction in the amount of risk that present. And then there's workplace practices. You need to have controls in place, agreements with the client, verifying that the clients have procedures in place that do not prevent workers from leaving the site or otherwise restrict their freedom of movement, that they are, if they are working in an isolated environment, that they have ways of communicating externally, communicating concerns or communicating to family and friends, and that any safety or health hazards that are present in that facility are well controlled. The next part of the cycle is tracking. We have monitoring as the subheader there because that's traditionally what we've called it, but tracking is tracking the implementation and the success of your due diligence. And what it means very simply is, are you achieving what you set out to achieve? Are workers being recruited ethically? are workers not paying fees. All of the things that are prohibited in the FAR or prohibited in international standards and a lot of the country laws in Europe, are you being successful in doing that? So that involves regular evaluation of your own operations, your subcontractor operations, and in particular, evaluation of the recruitment practices that are being followed by all of the actors in the labor supply chain. Tracking also helps you identify risks that you may not have thought of at the beginning. So when you did your initial risk assessment, you didn't understand that in this country, in this sector, there was a high risk of wage withholding for whatever reason. But you can find that during tracking when you do your detailed assessment, and then that gets built back into your risk assessment and the controls that need to be in place going forward. And probably the most important part of monitoring or tracking is engaging with workers. The workers are the ones that are impacted by whatever's going on. They're the ones that suffer the consequences of unethical recruitment. They also know the best way to address them. So unless you're engaging with workers throughout the due diligence cycle, when you're first assessing risks, when you're developing your controls, and now when you're tracking your progress, you're not going to have an effective due diligence system. They are the best, most reliable source of information on what's going on. And as you're developing tracking, you also need to consider who's responsible for this. We talked about embedding things in the business. Unless you have somebody that has formal responsibility and is actually being measured on their performance of getting this done, you're not likely to have an effective tracking process. You also have to think about what's the information that I'm going to be gathering in this tracking? Where am I getting it from? So you have things like grievance report, stakeholder feedback, maybe self-assessments that a service provider has done, third-party assessments, all kinds of data sources that you need to consider in putting together an effective tracking system. And then just a brief note on audits. I don't think it's a secret that the traditional audit has not been very effective in identifying forced labor risks. One is because forced labor risks aren't easy to find, especially if there isn't direct engagement with workers. And the other is audits historically, although it's changing, but historically have been much more of a kind of a check the box exercise, look for the document and move on. But if making sure that the process is effective, that it is deeply reaching out to workers and is looking for verification that, for example, as I mentioned before, that employers are paying recruitment fees up front, then the audit is not going to give you the information you need. From all of the tracking, you need to develop then corrective action plans where you root cause analysis so that the corrective actions you put in place really get to the root causes. And then probably even just as important as putting in place corrective actions is going back and verifying that those actions that you took actually reduced risk. Not that you go back 2 years later and find that you have the same problem recurring, but verification has to be a key part of this. Remediation is, as I said, it's something you undertake throughout the due diligence process, but it's how do you right a wrong? How do you make the affected person whole again? So if somebody paid fees, obviously it's going back and making sure that they've been reimbursed for whatever they paid, including, if they had paid interest on a loan over a period of years to pay those recruitment fees, that they're made whole for that as well. But it's basically fixing an impact that has occurred or putting in place something to address a risk that will prevent something from occurring in the future. And as I said, it occurs throughout due diligence, and it's a pretty straightforward process. You get data from grievance and from your tracking or monitoring. You get to the root cause, corrective actions, implement it, and then verify that it is effective. That brings me to grievance, which again is a key part of the worker engagement and a key part of tracking and the overall process to know that what you're doing is effective. But it's a big list of words. It's largely taken from the UN guiding principle 31 on grievance mechanisms. But essentially, you need to have a grievance process. The grievance process has to start at the farthest point of recruitment, so that if the job seeker has an issue with what's going on, they can alert somebody about that. But most importantly, it has to be trusted by the workers. It has to be something that the workers will use. If they don't trust it, if they think that there are going to be repercussions for filing a grievance, if they think that nothing's going to happen at all, if they think that there's going to be bias in the way that a grievance is resolved, then they're not going to use it. So make sure that any grievance process is trusted by the workers, that it keeps workers informed throughout the process of what's going on, when they're going to get the ultimate resolution. And only with all of the things that are listed in this page do you know that a grievance is going to be the incredibly effective tool that it needs to be. The last thing that I have here is, beyond grievance. Everyone thinks of worker engagement as really just grievance. Engaging with workers on a regular basis, on a very intentional basis, is another key to controlling risks. As I said, the worker is the one that's impacted by poor practices, and they're the ones that can tell you what's going on and often offer the best ideas in how to address those. So make sure that there's a formal engagement process, whether it's focus group interviews on a regular basis, or worker surveys, or worker organizations, either through a formal trade union or some other kind of worker representation. Without that, the controls that are developed, the corrective actions that are put in place, won't be as effective as they could be. We've been working with the State Department now for a number of years on the Responsible Sourcing Tool website. We've created a general set of tools when the FAR first came out back in 2016, and we've been refreshing it every year with tools in additional sectors. We've got tools for the private security sector, for food and beverage, for seafood, and now facility services. And the bulleted list you see here are the individual tools that you can use either alone or together with the others to establish and manage a good due diligence process to address the risks of human trafficking.
If audits historically do not identify forced labor risk, what do you believe is the best way to identify such? Obviously, thinking about how it works in the facility services sector is very useful, given that it's arm's length. It's really it's further upstream.
Yeah, it's the worker engagement, getting that feedback from workers is key, and it's difficult. Like we were saying, a lot of these work sites can be remote. The workers are at client sites; they're not necessarily at their employer's site, and so it makes creating and managing both an effective grievance process and a feedback process very difficult. But it's worth the effort to do that. Also, when you're doing assessments of facility services, the focus has to be on talking to the workers. And it's not always best to have the auditor. You know, you have an auditor from Germany go into a facility in Malaysia and try to talk to a worker who's from Nepal. You need to have on every audit team, if you're looking at human trafficking issues, you need to have interviewers who are trained to be worker interviewers, who speak the native language, who know how to gain the trust of workers, so that when you do ask a question, you're more likely to get the answer that's going to help you identify the risks at the site. If the worker feels at all intimidated by the auditor, and if they've been threatened already by their recruitment agent or by the employer to be quiet, the chance of getting anything meaningful is pretty slim. So native language interviewers really working on gaining trust and putting those systems in place to get feedback on a regular basis, so you don't have to rely on audits to identify the issues.
Can I throw something else in there?
Sure.
Particularly in relation to the tools and things, and sort of a due diligence approach, is if an audit is you're just showing up and trying to figure out what's going on, there's too much going on. That's one of the reasons that audits generally fail. If you actually make sure part of that assessment process includes looking at the management system of the organization, things like the contracting, how is that organization conducting due diligence? How is the employer conducting the due diligence of its service providers? You know, there's a lot of indicators there. So it isn't just about, you have to balance both, but clearly it's taking a systems approach, you know, is really vital to flagging situations so you can target those interviews, which are vital.
Yep.
And this is another great one, Michael. I don't know if you can see it, but could the panel speak to the role of labor standards certification programs and how they contribute or not to HRDD, and are there any certification programs relevant to the facility service sector?
I guess the question I'd ask is, are we talking about the certifications like to a particular standard, like a fair trade, or that kind of thing? Unfortunately, we don't have a standard for human rights and labor like we do for environment. There's no ISO equivalent of ISO 14000 or ISO 4501 for health and safety. ISO 26000, which started out a long time ago to be a standard, was eventually turned into a guidance document, which cannot be certified against. So, unfortunately, we don't have a good labor certification program that I'm aware of.
I think possibly they're thinking about like a RAP certification or a social fingerprint, or those kinds of certifications. Maybe is what.
Yeah. So if you're RAP certified, or if you're SA 8000 certified, those all of the standards that are out there, starting from the ETI base code all the way to RAP and ICTY and whatnot, can be effective. What we've seen over the years is the process that's followed to verify that those standards have been effectively implemented. So it goes back to the type of audit or evaluation that you do. Are you doing it in more of a checklist fashion, or are you verifying that all of the requirements of, say, SA 8000, are you verifying that those requirements have been put in place by talking to the workers? but a standard alone doesn't, or having a certification to a standard does not mean that there are effective procedures in place to control the risk. So I've been in many places that have been either ISO 14000 certified or they've been SA 8000 certified, and there are a lot of gaps. And unfortunately, there are a lot of employers when they go for certification, it looks like the goal line to them. Oh, we've done that. We can let back, and we don't have to worry about it. But SA 8000 wrap, it's a form of due diligence, and that it's a process. It needs to be always focused on, and it goes on and never ends. So certification is a step, but it doesn't mean that the risks are effectively controlled.
I think a related question to that we got is really with a lot of companies do not consider the services sector or their indirect as within scope. They don't consider, like to the question of grievance, can non-employees grieve through the employer's grievance system?
Sure.
If the service provider will say they have their own grievance system. So I think that's also kind of related to whether the certifications are covering the facility services sector or other indirect suppliers.
Yep.
Yeah. Another question is short-term contract considered is trafficking came in.
I mean, any contract, long or short term, can present human trafficking risks depending on how it was established. I mean, you could have an ironclad short-term contract. That's fine. There wasn't any deception. The person was told, you're hired for 90 days. This is what you're going to do. This is where you're going to work. This is how much you're getting paid. And, everything is just fine. And there can be others where it's kind of a day laborer who's hired off the street for some undefined period of time, doesn't have a written agreement or has a verbal agreement, and then it could be riddled with issues. So it all depends. Is the answer. You mentioned direct hire, and is that really practical when you deal with something like the size of the facility services sector? Maybe you can speak a little bit more about, is it more about ensuring that the agents are removed throughout this the brokers are removed throughout the process, or is it really specifically hire your janitors, which in certain supply chains maybe actually feel like it's very impractical? Yeah, I mean, there's kind of a continuum of what direct hiring means to, yeah, you hire everybody yourself. You do all the screening, the interviewing, the final selection. You do that in the country of work. You do that in the origin country by sending your folks there. That obviously is the best way to control risk, but it can also be very impractical for smaller organizations. So the next step is, well, let's reduce the number of agents involved and only have one agent that we've thoroughly vetted, that we have a good formal relationship with, that we trust, and we have them do the initial advertising and screening, and we do the final selection and hiring. We only have one layer that we have to worry about to control. But yeah, so direct hiring is not something that everybody can do, but reducing the number of actors involved in the supply chain is something that any company, even a small company, can get their arms around.
I think I'd like to read this comment. I don't think it's seen by all the participants, so I wanted to read this one as a potential way to close, which is, thank you for the presentation. As I have conducted audits 10 years in the ME, the audits are measured the situation on the field. Audits are 1 to 3 days. The remediations are not managed in a proper way, and the audit organizations are not allowed to guide, track, and be a part of the remediation program. Whoever defines the problem on the field, they should also be part of the solution. The effectiveness should not be consecutive audits. It should be regular visits without day limits and source. Otherwise, the audit looks like just data collection. Nobody knows how to close the issues or whether the issues are closed. Also, audits also coordinate with the team at both the source country and the country where the workers are. However, this is not a question, feedback. Anyway, I think that I just think that the notion of making it not sort of a helicopter in, sort of the one-off, every year, every third year or whatever, but to be a more of an integrated routine process is the point of it. And I just wanted to share that. But I think we are
absolutely right. You know, dropping in for a day or 3 days, you're getting a snapshot. If you're not involved in monitoring the performance over time, or developing the solutions, or verifying the effectiveness of the solutions, and there's just another audit in 2 years or 3 years, that model doesn't work. So this comment is right on target.
The chat on the side, which I think you might not be able to see also, is just really about getting it right up front. It's front loading the due diligence, where you really select the right agency. You do your due diligence on this business partner, and you make sure that they have, the will and the commitment and the capacity. And if not, to ensure that you work with them to build it up if they're going to be a long-term partner, to be able to control these risks. So people know, so there's a tool set. If it wasn't clear, there's a tool set on responsible right now. And the tool set really for the facilities service sector takes you kind of through all of those circles on the Tinker Toy of the due diligence framework, for policies, for flagging, for screening, for interviewing workers. It's a comprehensive integrated set there, as well as there's research and reporting on the risks in the facilities, the facility service sectors. Last, anything from you, Amy, before we go? Final comment?
Sure. Well, thank you, Verité. And I wanted to just say thank you to all the attendees for your time, for your interest in learning more, and most especially for your current and future work to prevent human trafficking in your global supply chains. We appreciate it.